contributed to its size and to workers' reluctance to join the waterfront strike. Communists only began organizing in Mobile in August 1934, 2 months before the strike. In response to the West Coast waterfront strike, the communist-led MWIU created a joint strike preparations committee with support from the ISU and a few active members of the nearly defunct IWW. On the eve of the walkout, the committee convinced the ILA in Mobile to join the strike, raising the total number of strikers to a minuscule 400 workers. But after 3 days, the ISU and ILA called their members back to work. William McGee, president of the MWIU in Mobile, criticized the union's turnabout on the strike decision and organized a mass rally of about 100 black and white seamen, but police dispersed the crowd before the 36. Although the party's role in the 1934 strike wave was uneven and often insignificant, opponents attributed practically every action associated with worker rebellion to the CP. Birmingham newspapers carried headlines such as "Strike moves near climax, Reds linked with violence," and 37. Ironically, daily worker reports confirmed the fears of many Birmingham residents by exaggerating the party's role and, in an odd way, by attracting radical artists and intellectuals from outside Alabama. The outsiders' brief forays to Birmingham, which usually included a day with the SCU, resembled artists' sojourns to the front during the Spanish Civil War. They wanted to witness firsthand the heroism of Dixie's interracial vanguard, and those who experienced police repression or harassment wore their stripes proudly. Among them were luminaries such as playwright and novelist John Howard Lawson, authors Jack Conroy, Myra Page, and Grace Lumpkin, and visual artist Paul Weller, most of whom used the experiences or knowledge they obtained in 38. The party's strong showing at the 1934 May Day demonstration, which coincided with the most intense period of strike activity, fueled the notion that communists provoked the unrest. The party's first major rally since the May Day debacle of the previous year attracted over 5,000 people to Capitol Park, despite the city commission's last-minute revocation of a parade permit. Police prepared for the event by mounting machine guns atop the Jefferson County Jail and enlisting the support of approximately 1,500 white legionnaires. Before the speakers could address the crowd, police officers and legionnaires began beating and arresting. 39. Under orders from Birmingham Police Chief E. L. Hollums, officers launched a wave of retaliatory raids several days after the demonstration, jailing nearly a dozen communists on charges ranging from vagrancy to criminal anarchy. The first wave of arrestees, comprised primarily of local leaders and known visitors, included Louise Thompson, a black International Workers' Order representative visiting from New York. The incarceration of renowned radical playwright John Howard Lawson, who was charged with libel for his Daily Worker article describing the arrests and trials of 6 Birmingham communist leaders, attracted national attention to civil liberties violations in Birmingham. The wave of repression even piqued the ACLU's interest, particularly after Birmingham's Western Union office manager refused to transmit 2 dispatches from a Daily Worker correspondent because he found them to be highly 40. While the sensationalist claims of the press were more invention than reality, they had the effect of promoting the Communist Party from mere nuisance to Birmingham's #1 public enemy in the minds of many. For their growing popularity, the Communists had to bear the brunt of anti-labor violence. The Red Squad, a special unit of the Birmingham Police Department headed by Detective J. T. Moser, became a beehive of activity. Although police had both the 1930 Criminal Anarchy Ordinance and vagrancy laws at their disposal, the Red Squad more commonly invoked Section 4902 of the Birmingham Criminal Code because it allowed police, without a warrant, to arrest and detain anyone for up to 72 hours without charge. Section 4902 was used to obtain information and or to 41. Clyde Johnson, who had been arrested by the Birmingham police force at least 3 times in 1934, was severely beaten while being held incommunicado. At first I didn't think they were interested in me answering questions because they'd ask a question, and if I didn't respond quickly enough, they started beating the living hell out of me on my head. And then they'd make me put my hands on the table, and they started pounding at my hands. They broke a couple of fingers. They kept at this and I didn't answer. I decided they were going to kill me. I went unconscious, and they threw water at me, and I went through it some more. When they picked me up 42. Black communist Helen Longs was arrested for distributing leaflets explaining the party's election platform. Although the charge was eventually reduced to disorderly conduct, the police detained her under Section 4902 and proceeded with their peculiar form of interrogation. 3 of them had rubber hoses, 1 had a strap, and 1 had a blackjack. The biggest one of the men tried to make me lie down, but I wouldn't. Then they hit me with the hose and with the strap with such force as almost to knock me down, but when I didn't fall, the biggest man finally grabbed me and threw me down. While they had me on the floor, one of them would beat me until he got tired, and then another would start in. Then 2 or 3 would beat me at the same time until I nearly lost 43. The Red Squad stepped up its activities during the summer, jailing dozens of communists charged with violating the Criminal Anarchy Ordinance. In July, police arrested Israel Berlin for possessing party literature, and a few days later he was jailed again, along with communists John Baydell and Fred Keith, when police seized the entire August edition of the Southern Worker. Editor Elizabeth Lawson retaliated by putting out a special 6-page edition of the Southern Worker and sending a complimentary copy to Police Chief Hollums. In August, police raided the home of 66-year-old Addie Adkins and discovered 25,000 leaflets appealing to workers to support the textile strike. Adkins was arrested and charged with distributing literature, advocating overthrow of the government by force. In nearly all of these cases, however, the charges were dismissed by judges who ruled that party literature did not violate the Criminal Anarchy Ordinance. 44. Frustrated by the Criminal Anarchy Ordinance's ineffectiveness, Police Chief Hollums and City Commissioner W.O. Downs promoted much stronger anti-communist legislation. In May, the commissioner drafted the infamous Downs Literature Ordinance, which made it unlawful to possess one or more copies of radical literature, defined to include any anti-war or anti-fascist material, labor publications, and liberal journals such as the New Republic and The Nation. The maximum sentence for violating the ordinance was 6 months in jail plus a fine of $100. The Birmingham City Commission adopted the ordinance in October, and the City Council of 45. Although AFL leaders were well aware that anti-sedition laws could be used against organized labor, they did not protest the legislation. On the contrary, the Birmingham and Bessemer Trades Councils not only championed the new ordinances but called for even stronger measures. Robert Moore, president of the AFL, felt the Downs Ordinance still was not restrictive enough to deal with the threat of communism. "We have no adequate laws in Alabama," he announced, "to meet the constantly increasing threat from this source, but we can oust every known communist from within the ranks of organized labor, and we propose to do just that." W.O. Hare, secretary of the AFL, followed Moore's advice and attempted. 46. With the passage of the Downs Ordinance, the number of arrests rose dramatically, but as with the Criminal Anarchy Ordinance preceding it, convictions were few and far between. Of 60 arrests in less than a year. 47. Where due process failed, extra-legal terrorist organizations succeeded. The White Legion directed virtually all of its energies toward fighting communism, from distributing propaganda to burning crosses on the lawns of white Tarrant City communists. In Birmingham, the Klan, which had declined substantially in the late 1920s, rode the crest of anti-labor and anti-communist sentiment in 1934. In that same year, 44 new Klaverns were organized in northern Alabama alone, and a local fascist movement affiliated with the Klan began publishing the Alabama Black Shirt. The Klan's rebirth was signaled by the appearance of thousands of leaflets warning Birmingham's blacks to stay clear of the communists. 48. The parades, literature, and other symbolic gestures were intended to intimidate activists as well as to build support among whites, but these public displays of white supremacy failed to silence Alabama radicals. Indeed, Black ILD organizers occasionally responded with their own leaflets, such as the one warning, "KKK! The workers are watching you!" The vigilantes' real influence lay in extra-legal acts of violence, usually perpetrated with the assistance of local law enforcement agencies. The number of vigilante assaults on communists and suspected communists rose rapidly during the strike wave and continued well into 1935. In the aftermath of the ore miners' strike, Clyde Johnson survived at least 3 assassination attempts. Black communist Steve Simmons suffered a near-fatal beating at the hands of Klansmen in North Birmingham, and a few months later his black comrade in Bessemer, Saul Davis, was kidnapped by a gang of white TCI employees, stripped bare, and flogged for several hours. These examples represent only a fraction of the 49. As 1934 came to a close, District Organizer Nat Ross and Secretary Ted Wellman felt the time had come to take stock of the past in order to chart a new direction for the future. Wellman observed in a Daily Worker article that the communists' role in the strikes, compounded by the fact that they had suffered an inordinate amount of retaliatory violence, earned them the admiration and support of many industrial workers. He even admitted that Birmingham's working class, in many cases, pushed the party members into activity by asking for leaflets and for information about meetings and activities. Yet, in the party's theoretical journals and internal organs, Wellman and Ross were far less effusive with their praise. Both submitted reports criticizing the Birmingham cadre for failing to build mine and shop units in the most important centers of industry, and for expending all their energy on organizing the strikes instead of recruiting and educating industrial workers. In Nat Ross's words, they did not sufficiently explain the connection between the struggle against the differential wage and the struggle of the sharecroppers, and between the struggle for the freedom of the Scottsboro Boys and the whole fight for the right to self-determination. In the Black Belt, All writers agreed, however, that the level of repression hindered the party's work. 50. Ironically, the proliferation of anti-radical violence in 1934 seemed to act as a catalyst for the party's growth. Like many others who joined in. Anti-communist handbill distributed by the Ku Klux Klan in Birmingham in the 1930s, Labor Defender. 1934 Jesse G. Owens, a one-time socialist from Terrence City, interpreted the violence as proof that the communists must have something that was for the good of the working class. According to party sources, 300 new members joined during the intense 6-week period of labor activity beginning in April 1934, and by May the communists claimed 1,000 in the Birmingham district alone, while the ILD's ranks swelled to 51. More significant than the numbers, however, is the fact that violence compelled local communists to make anti-radical repression and the denial of civil liberties a central issue on their agenda. The emphasis on police repression and violence was not only evident in the assessments offered by Nat Ross and Ted Wellman, but subtle changes in the party's entire program became apparent during the 1934 election campaign. As in 1933, the party ran candidates associated with organized labor, but the issue of civil liberties took precedence over everything else on the party's platform. Insisting that the KKK, the White Legion, and other armed fascist bands be outlawed, the communists held a demonstration in front of the Birmingham courthouse to demand the right to vote without any restrictions whatsoever. When the city commission turned down their application for a permit to hold an election rally in Capitol Park, the communists organized several smaller rallies in the neighborhood's sick and sections of the city, in order to avoid police and fascist violence. The right of free speech and assembly became a campaign priority, articulated as a basic right denied all working people. The Communist Party will grow stronger every day and will soon take its constitutional right to speak to. 52. While it is impossible to accurately measure the party's influence in the labor movement, it is clear that the communists' impact was far greater than their numbers indicate. They operated as the proverbial gadflies, criticizing AFL policies, popularizing strikes through publications, leaflets, and pickets, and convincing small groups of workers, including a handful of whites, of the virtues of socialism. Indeed, the communist-led rank-and-file committees were the only organized voices within the Alabama labor movement to consistently fight against racial discrimination and to build alliances between strikers in different industries. But the more they asserted themselves in the 1934 strike wave, the greater the intensity of anti-radical violence, and the more difficult it became for them to work openly. Unlike the neighborhood relief committees or the unemployed councils, which were organized and run by communists, the labor movement's relationship to the party was ambivalent, to say the least. Surrounded by hostile trade union leaders, communists had to perform the unenviable task of building a base of support while operating as outsiders. Their difficulties were compounded by the fact that they were not merely anonymous outsiders, but outsiders with a volatile reputation. Their activities in the courtrooms and on the streets on behalf of poor black men accused of rape and other assorted crimes followed the communists into the workplace and the relief offices. In a word, Alabama communists operated under the shadow of Scottsboro, a shadow that generated as much vicious hatred as unqualified respect. It is to this shadow that we shall now turn. I reckon you take up for those Ridgeons. Talk about lynching. That whole country ought to be lynched, making women public property. The Rougeon Reds had better not come over here trying to nationalize my daughter. Grace Lumpkin, a sign for Cain. We wish to call your attention to the inroads being made among people of this city and state, white and colored, by insidious propaganda of communism, which we are being looked to curb and do propose to combat and destroy, in keeping with the spirit of our organization, but find ourselves handicapped on every hand because the red propagandist uses the very things herein pointed out to attract followers and to create disrespect for law and order, and to incite mob-s and mob violence, which we know to be futile and destructive to the best interests of our people. Birmingham NAACP Petition to City Commission, 1933. On March 25, 1931, 9 black men, ages 13 to 19, were pulled from a locomotive boxcar and arrested near Paint Rock, Alabama, for allegedly assaulting some young white men who were also riding the rails. When authorities discovered 2 white women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, riding on the same train, the charge against the alleged assailants was promptly changed to rape, even though none of the black men shared the same boxcar as the women. Indicted without benefit of legal counsel, the 9 defendants were taken to nearby Scottsboro and held in the Jackson County Jail. Although no evidence of rape was introduced by 1. The prosecution, the Scottsboro boys were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death within 3 days. In light of the South's record of injustice to blacks, the speed with which the all-white jury handed down its decision should not be surprising. However, Scottsboro stands out from any number of similar cases because the defendants received unsolicited outside assistance from the communist-led ILD. As soon as word of the arrests reached local newspapers, ILD officials located the defendants' families in Chattanooga, offered legal services, and made preparations to publicize the case. The ILD's strategy was to focus international attention on what would have been a quiet, soon forgotten trial. On April 12, 13,000 people assembled in Cleveland to protest the Scottsboro frame-up. And on the following day nearly 20,000 demonstrators in New York demanded the immediate release of the 9 defendants. Within the next few weeks, Scottsboro defense committees were formed, demonstrations were organized, and telegrams and letters of protest from across the country. 2. The ILD entered a far more taxing and complex battle than its leaders had ever imagined. Its offer of free legal counsel and active public support for alleged Negro rapists was not only seen as a direct assault on white womanhood. From the outset, the ILD was tainted by a peculiar myth that linked communism to sexual promiscuity and miscegenation. In the South, the word communism itself, pronounced communism, according to W. J. Cash, had a curiously explicit sexual connotation derived from stereotyped visions of 19th-century utopian communal societies, which suggested that notions of free love were integrally tied to communal living. Moreover, the presence of white women in an organization with an even larger proportion of black men spurred Southern white imaginations. The Birmingham Labor Advocate warned its readers to beware of outside agitators who, under the cover of darkness, disseminated red literature preaching free love and intermarriage. The presumed promiscuity of female communists, black or white, became an axiom in Alabama, especially after Scottsboro. While confined to a Birmingham jail cell in 1932, Alice Burke had to endure assorted remarks from police officers who insisted that she desired to sleep with all 9 Scottsboro defendants. Everybody knew, she recalled amusingly, that I was a lover of blacks. 2 years later, black communist Louise Thompson was handled in a similar manner in a Birmingham courtroom. During cross-examination, both the prosecuting attorney and the judge were inclined at first to make a joke of the affairs, taunting me about my comrades, slyly alluding to some intimate relationship with the men. 3. The belief that communists intended to make women public property, available to all irrespective of race, served as a powerful buffer against communism. Black men, it was suggested over and over again, were drawn to communism because it meant having access to the dominant society's greatest treasure, white women. Wrote one observer. In the eyes of colored men, complete equality with the whites, as proclaimed by Moscow, means free possession of white women. Some of the party's detractors even suggested that the communists planned to wage a sexual revolution alongside the class struggle. During the 1934 strike wave, the Birmingham White Legion issued leaflets asking white citizens, "How would you like to awaken one morning to find your wife or daughter attacked by a Negro or a communist?" 2 white Alabamians underscored this point in a popular 1936 polemic aptly titled Scottsboro, the Firebrand of Communism. Echoing popular racist notions equating savagery with sexual lasciviousness, they argued that communists aimed their propaganda at the black man, with the hope that it will ignite the spark of savagery that. 4. The ILD's presence aroused an equally passionate, though much different, response from black Alabamians. The party had already built a strong base of support within black working-class communities because of its relief campaign, but once the ILD entered the Scottsboro case, the CP quickly earned a reputation as a race organization. Although the move grew out of a pre-existing policy to defend all class war prisoners, the ILD suddenly found itself immersed in the world of race politics. Through their participation in the Scottsboro defense, as well as a panoply of local cases involving black defendants, ILD activists directly challenged the leadership of Birmingham's black elite. Once Scottsboro hit the daily newspapers, Birmingham's traditional black leaders at first dissociated themselves from the case and berated the communists for meddling in Southern affairs. The Birmingham World, in an editorial entitled, "Cast Down Your Buckets Where You Are," supported Alabama's legal system 100%. Birmingham, the writer explained, has proved sick that a man can get a just and fair trial in the Southland regardless of color. While questioning the evidence presented in court, Oscar Adams, editor of the Black Birmingham Reporter, nevertheless felt the defendants' testimony carried little weight because they were poorly trained and primitive when we think of intelligence. NAACP National Secretary Walter White also expressed some skepticism at first. Adopting a wait-and-see attitude, he did not send a lawyer to Alabama until the 9 defendants had been convicted. White questioned the ILD's intentions, suggesting that the organization was interested less in the defendants' welfare than in revolution as ordered from Moscow. Furthermore, he believed the ILD duped the parents into accepting its support since the defendants' families were, in White's words, of humble background and 5. White nevertheless recognized that black public opinion was beginning to shift toward the ILD. He had hoped to wrest control of the case from the ILD, but the paralyzed state of the NAACP in Alabama and the overall timorousness of Birmingham's black elite precluded any local intervention. 1 month after the first trial, National Director of Branches Robert Bagnall partly blamed the Birmingham branch for the NAACP's failure to enter the case, suggesting that if local organization had been stronger, the Scottsboro case might have received instant attention. In January 1931, the Birmingham branch claimed a total paid membership of 6, a figure that included all of Jefferson County. Independent efforts failed as well. 2 years earlier, Oscar Adams and members of the black business community had established the Birmingham Benevolent and Legal Aid Association to enable progressive and forward-looking Negroes of substantial worth to assist the less fortunate and underprivileged Negro to get a hearing in court. After a few sparsely attended meetings, however, the organization had disbanded, leaving a dying NAACP and several well-attended social. 6. The black elite's ambivalence, timidity, and organizational weakness contrasted sharply with the party's growing strength and quixotic approach to politics. Almost a year before Scottsboro, the party launched a regional anti-lynching campaign that had been motivated by a multiple lynching in Kelley, Alabama. On July 4, 1930, Tom Robertson, a black sharecropper and reputed racial militant, was attacked by vigilantes following an argument he had had with a local white storekeeper over the price of a battery. While most of the small-town folks of Kelley were celebrating American Independence Day, a mob gathered at Robertson's home. Tom Robertson tried his best to stave off the attack with buckshot, but once he ran out of ammunition, the mob broke down his door and lynched 4 members of his family. He and the rest of his relatives then became game in a rapacious manhunt, inspired by a $300 reward offered by Alabama Governor Bibb Graves, that ended only when Robertson was captured 2 months later. The ILD publicized the case, but it did not have the resources to provide Robertson legal counsel. He died in the electric chair on January 7. The events in Kelley, Alabama, became a catalyst for the revival of the ANLC, a communist auxiliary whose support had been declining steadily since its founding in 1925. A preliminary meeting held in Chattanooga in October attracted an enthusiastic crowd, and a few weeks later over 120 delegates, including Southern Garveyites, gathered in St. Louis to attend an ANLC-sponsored National Anti-Lynching Convention. From this particular meeting a new organization developed, the LSNR, to replace the dying 8. The party's response to the Scottsboro arrests, therefore, grew directly from these events. By December 1930, ILD leaders not only placed anti-lynching activity high on their list of priorities but now began to define virtually all African Americans falsely accused of capital offenses as class war prisoners. As the local NAACP tried in vain to win over the Scottsboro defendants, Birmingham ILD activists took up other local cases. In April 1931, the party, the ILD, and the newly created LSNR chapter protested the police shooting of an unarmed black man, Babe Dawes, a suspect in a recent shooting in Birmingham. Dawes reportedly complied with police orders but was gunned down nonetheless. 2 months later, the ILD protested the lynching of Thomas Jasper in Huntsville, Alabama, but demands for a full investigation and the death penalty for his murderers did not result in a 9. These local cases were rarely publicized outside the communist press, and even the CP tabloids paid more attention to the Scottsboro case. But by late summer 1931, a case involving a black man accused of raping and murdering 2 prominent Birmingham white women nearly rivaled Scottsboro as a cause célèbre in Alabama and further intensified local conflict between the ILD and the NAACP. On August 4, 1931, sisters Nell and Augusta Williams and a friend, Jenny Wood, were driving through Shades Valley, just beyond the Birmingham city limits, when a black man reportedly leapt upon the automobile's running board and forced the driver at gunpoint to take a back road to a wooded area, where all 3 were allegedly robbed and then raped. When Nell Williams attempted to disarm their assailant, he shot and killed Wood and injured the 2 sisters. Augusta Williams did not survive her injuries. She died in the hospital hours later. 10. Press reports tried to link the Communist Party to the assault after Nell Williams claimed that the 3 women were forced to listen to a lengthy harangue about the race problem and communism. After intercourse, enraged white citizens and police launched a reign of terror against blacks in general and Birmingham communists in particular. Several communists, including district organizer Harry Jackson, were jailed within days of the shooting, and dozens of young black men were killed or wounded by police. According to Angelo Herndon, who was also arrested during the fracas, lynch mobs rushed through the streets in the Negro sections of the town like maniacs. Black businesses in the suburb of Woodlawn were firebombed, and for several weeks lights were shut off in black communities by 10 p.m. as part of the city-imposed curfew on African. 11. Fearing a potential race riot, Birmingham's traditional black leaders tried desperately to calm the white community. A black welfare organization released a statement impugning the awful crime committed against womanhood by one of our race, and a group of black businessmen offered a $3,300 reward for the capture of the Williamses' assailant. The communists felt the reward was inappropriate and accused the black elite of helping the white ruling class place the noose about the neck of some. 12. Communist activity in Alabama. In less than 2 weeks, a subcommittee composed of black and white clergy, educators, and liberal businessmen produced a slim report titled Radical Activities in Alabama. Conceding that black working people were at the center of party activity, the report maintained that blacks were merely dupes of white radicals endowed with blacks' ancient wrongs. The report explained. Their new hopes, their ignorance, and their trustful natures are counted on to make them readily responsive to the revolutionary appeal. 13. About a month later, after the hysteria had died down and Nell Williams had recovered from the shooting, she and her brother Dent Williams spotted a black man, 35-year-old Willie Peterson, walking along the sidewalk. When she identified him as the assailant, Dent Williams accosted Peterson with his pistol drawn and performed a citizen's arrest. Emphatically proclaiming his innocence, the thin, sickly, dark-skinned, Southern-born Willie Peterson did not in any way fit the original description given by Williams, who had described her attacker as a stout, light-skinned, educated Northerner. Moreover, several witnesses claimed they had seen Peterson on the other side of town when the crime was committed. It was so obvious Williams had chosen the wrong man that both the Jefferson County Sheriff and the state solicitor privately admitted that a mistake had been made. To quell any doubt about Peterson's guilt, Dent Williams arranged a meeting with the sheriff at which his sister was supposed to make a positive identification. As soon as Peterson emerged from his cell, Dent drew a concealed pistol and shot him several times. Though he was already suffering from aggravated tuberculosis, Peterson. 14. With very little solid evidence, the prosecution approached the case from a different angle altogether. Amid press reports claiming the assailant lectured on communism and the race question, after raping the 3 women, the prosecution tried to link Willie Peterson to the communists by invoking the sexual connotations associated with the popular image of communism. Peterson's grueling interrogation while an inmate at Kilby Prison is quite revealing on this score. Question: You had been to meetings where they said the Negroes were as good as white people and ought to be treated like white people? A. I don't remember. Question: You know what a communist is, don't you? A communist? Question: The people going around preaching to Negroes that they ought to take the stand that they are as good as white folks and that they ought to marry white folks. 15. Dazed by the arrest and shooting of her husband, Henrietta Peterson immediately turned to the ILD. As ILD lawyers and activists began making plans for Peterson's defense, Birmingham NAACP leaders, prodded by Walter White, fought for control of the case. Once Henrietta Peterson's decision became public, NAACP Secretary Charles McPherson persuaded her to disavow the ILD retainer she had signed and allow the NAACP to take the case. McPherson told her that the ILD was an illegal organization and that any mass campaign for Peterson's freedom will make the white people in Birmingham mad. The people with whom you are dealing, he warned, believe in overthrowing the government. They do not care anything about your husband, they are using him as a pawn to get a foothold in America. You will be railroading your husband to the electric chair if you follow them. Fearing for her husband's safety, she followed McPherson's advice and switched to a respectable Birmingham law firm. 16. Although the first trial in December ended in a hung jury, Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder in a second trial in January 1932, on the strength of testimony from one Henry Wilson. Reputedly a black Tuscaloosa barber, Wilson testified that Peterson had bragged about the crime to everyone in his shop. When an investigator revealed that Wilson was actually Tom Shepard, a construction worker who had been paid $10 to lie on the stand, it made no difference. After less than 20. 17. The Birmingham NAACP branch urged Roach and Johnson to appeal the case, a decision that augmented the association's popularity and revitalized the dwindling organization. Under Charles McPherson's leadership, the Birmingham branch convinced some prominent black clergy and professionals to establish a defense fund for Peterson. Now that the NAACP could boast of its own Scottsboro, McPherson acknowledged in February, Birmingham is just about ripe for a rehabilitation. 3 months later, the same branch that only a year earlier could not achieve a 18. The ILD's persistent mass campaign on Peterson's behalf proved to be a painful thorn in the side of the newly reconstituted NAACP. When the Birmingham Post published an article linking the two organizations as defenders of Negro cases, the local NAACP branch responded with a patriotic letter distancing itself from the ILD and claiming no connection whatsoever with the Scottsboro case. In fact, distinguishing itself from the ILD seemed to be the whole point of the Peterson campaign, with respect to politics. The communists Walter White complained to Roy Wilkins. "Keep ballyhooing about the Peterson case, and we want to keep in the minds of the public that it is the NAACP and not the communists who are fighting for him." But the proliferation of communist-led Peterson defense committees convinced large numbers of black Birmingham working people. 19. While the Peterson and Scottsboro cases found ample space in communist and mainstream newspapers, another rape case occurred which escaped nearly everyone's attention. In May 1932, a 12-year-old black Birmingham girl, Meredith Dixon, was hired by a white man who lived in the vicinity to perform domestic chores. When she arrived at his home, he forced her into a wooded section of the city and raped her at knife point. Witnesses came forward, but police refused to arrest the man and the case never went to trial. The Dixon case is illuminating for the conspicuous silence it evoked from leading white communists, black middle-class spokespersons, and white liberals. Neither the NAACP, the CIC, nor the ILD investigated the matter, and Meredith Dixon's story never made it to the columns of mainstream Birmingham newspapers or the Southern Worker. Only the Garveyite Negro World found a small space in its pages to report the incident. Only a small group of local black communists took an interest in the case. Calling themselves the Liberation Committee, Al Murphy, Hosea Hudson, and Joe Burton sought support from black clergy in order to pressure police into charging Dixon's assailant. However, traditional black spokesmen remained silent, and the Liberation Committee was unable to mobilize the kind of mass support Willie Peterson and the Scottsboro Nine enjoyed. Perhaps the indifference to Dixon's case can be partly attributed to the age-old double standard that casts white women as pure and virtuous and black women as naturally promiscuous. These notions apparently penetrated political practice to the point where the rape of a 12-year-old. 20. As the summer approached and Meredith Dixon's rape tragically faded from memory, former Birmingham activist Angelo Herndon was added to the ILD's growing list of political prisoners. Herndon, who had recently been assigned to work among the Atlanta unemployed, was convicted of violating an old slave insurrection law for organizing an interracial relief. 21. With the Scottsboro and Herndon cases achieving national prominence just before the 1932 election campaign, Southern ILD District Organizer Donald Burke announced plans for an all-Southern Scottsboro and Civil Rights Conference to be held in Birmingham on October 2nd. In anticipation of the largest ILD gathering to date, several small preliminary mass meetings were held throughout the city, including an outdoor demonstration of 200 at which Viola Montgomery, mother of Scottsboro defendant Olin Montgomery, gave the keynote speech. As local organizations prepared for the October 2nd conference, Klansmen, vigilantes, and law enforcement agencies intensified anti-radical repression. When black communist organizer Otto Hall arrived from New York, he was arrested, beaten, and deposited outside the city limits. A few days later, Klansmen organized a 20-car motorcade through the black community. 22. The All-Southern Scottsboro and Civil Rights Conference went on as scheduled in spite of police and Klan intimidation. Altogether, some 300 blacks and 50 whites packed the Negro Masonic Temple, and between 500 and 1,000 black residents were turned away for lack of space or because of the military atmosphere surrounding the hall. While the crowd listened to addresses by communists Donald and Alice Burke, Mary Leonard, and Uncle Ben Fowler, a black ILD organizer, and Jackleg Preacher, about 80 police officers equipped with 3 machine guns and a box of tear gas bombs established posts across the street from the hall. As Hosea Hudson recalls, the people who attended the conference all was in overalls and half-ragged, but many appeared not to have been intimidated. Negroes just walked all under them rifles, just went on in the door and on to the meeting, had them standing on the corner too. 23. The response to the conference even surprised its organizers. Afterward, the Birmingham ILD office was suddenly flooded with volunteers, and soon its core of 2 or 3 dozen organizers burgeoned to 200 active members. A local officer for the U.S. Military Intelligence Division woefully conceded late in 1932 that the ILD had created a favorable impression among Negroes, and some reports intimated that Negroes were. 24. Birmingham party leaders looked to take advantage of the ILD's growing popularity. Even before the Central Committee promoted broad-based, united front politics, local communist leaders began to make overtures toward white liberals and traditional black leaders to unite around legal defense cases. A month after the Birmingham conference, District Organizer Nat Ross suggested that a revitalized ILD composed of non-revolutionary workers and middle-class elements of all political and religious faiths would be even more effective as long as the party gives close guidance. Liberal and black middle-class spokespersons ignored Ross's invitation at first, but a string of unexpected circumstances created a new set of opportunities for joint action. Over a year before the new Scottsboro trials opened on March 27, 1933, one of the alleged victims, Ruby Bates, repudiated the rape charge, admitting that she had been forced by police to lie. Yet, despite new evidence and a brilliant defense, the all White Alabama jury found Haywood Patterson, the first defendant, guilty. 25. Patterson's conviction aroused considerable indignation among African Americans. When the NAACP Board of Directors attributed the verdict to ILD tactics, Walter White and the association were attacked from all corners of the nation's black populace. Local NAACP branches, newspaper editors, churches, and several radical organizations harshly criticized the association's national leadership. Practically overnight, the NAACP reversed its original statement and agreed to aid the ILD and raise money for the Scottsboro defense. 26. Birmingham branch leaders did not oppose re-entering the Scottsboro case, but many cringed at the idea of working directly with the ILD. Critical of the decision, McPherson wrote to White, "I am afraid that the association has been too hasty to re-enter the Scottsboro cases without first working out a definite agreement with that lobbied crowd. You see, coming as it does like a thunderbolt out of a clear sky, it puts us in a bad plight right here in the heart of the trouble. I urge you that an agreeable working arrangement be definitely formed separating the two organizations so as not to embarrass us." Birmingham branch leaders immediately issued a press release explaining the NAACP's sudden change of heart with respect to the ILD, decrying the party's revolutionary goals and declaring their own patriotism in unambiguous terms. "We are American citizens, red, white, and blue." Birmingham NAACP leaders argued that intervention was necessary for the purpose of controlling, and restricting the ILD's activities and 27. A few weeks before the NAACP announced its decision to establish ties with the ILD, a group of white liberals and clergymen founded the Birmingham Citizens Scottsboro Aid Committee. In defiance of city segregation ordinances, the committee held its first mass rally on March 31. Over 1,000 people packed the First Congregational Church for the event, and when standing room was no longer available, according to one observer, hundreds remained milling outside. The principal speakers included Rabbi Benjamin Goldstein of the Temple Beth or in Montgomery, Dr. Kenneth E. Barnhart, a professor of sociology recently expelled from Birmingham Southern College because of his political views, and Mrs. H. C. Bryant, president of the Black YWCA in Birmingham. NAACP branch president E. W. Taggart made an unexpected and unauthorized appearance. To the chagrin of several co-activists, Taggart not only attended the meeting in defiance of branch orders but had advocated joint action with the ILD months before national leaders opted to do so. On Easter Sunday, the Citizens Scottsboro Aid Committee held another successful mass meeting in Birmingham, but this time the party's presence was far more evident. Speeches by Jane Speed, Mary Leonard, and Scottsboro Mother Ada Wright emphasized the ILD's contribution to both the Scottsboro and Peterson cases and challenged the Citizens Scottsboro Aid Committee to adopt mass pressure as a central component of its program. 28. Disappointment over the Patterson verdict led several mainstream black political figures to express some qualified support for the ILD's tactics, though these sympathies were short-lived. The already tenuous alliance was broken abruptly when, 2 weeks after the Easter meeting, violence erupted during the Communists' May Day demonstration. Liberals and sympathetic black elites turned against the ILD, and those who remained sympathetic to the left faced a groundswell of opposition from conservatives. Rabbi Benjamin Goldstein, the radical religious leader who had participated in Montgomery's Marxist study circles, was forced to leave the state because of his support for the ILD. Hostility toward Goldstein was complicated by antisemitism, partly sparked by the ILD's choice of Samuel Leibovitz as principal counsel in the Scottsboro case. Faced with boycotts and Klan threats, Jewish merchants and other leading members of Montgomery's Temple Beth or congregation not only asked Goldstein to resign but issued a statement to the press repudiating any outside interference in Southern. 29. A series of events in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a few months later further weakened chances for reconciliation between liberals and communists. On June 14, 1933, 3 black men, Dan Pippin, Jr., Elmore, Honey, Clark, and A. T. Hardin, were picked up by police after the body of a 21-year-old white woman was discovered near Big Sandy. Although there was no concrete evidence linking them to the death, Pippin and Clark were charged with murder and rape, and Hardin was said to have been an accessory to the crime. Tuscaloosa ILD organizer Lewis Harper persuaded the 3 defendants to hire ILD attorneys, but under pressure from the court and police, Hardin and Clark repudiated their retainers. With the support of his mother, Pippin insisted on his right to ILD counsel, but when his lawyers arrived in Tuscaloosa, Judge Henry B. Foster barred them from the court. Once word spread that communist Jew lawyers were in Tuscaloosa, attorneys Frank B. Irving Schwab, and Alan Taub escaped a sure lynching by leaving town in disguise under the reluctant protection of the National Guard. The 3 defendants were not so lucky. 2 weeks later, so as to avoid another Scottsboro case, Tuscaloosa deputies turned the 3 men over to a lynch mob. Beaten, burned, and Riddled with bullets, Elmore Clark somehow survived and made his way to the home of a black woman in the area. As soon as a local black physician dressed his wounds, Clark was turned over to authorities in Montgomery. 30. The lynching of Pippin and Hardin prompted a flood of angry correspondence from around the country, much of it holding Judge Henry B. Foster responsible. In nearby Birmingham, communists held a statewide anti-lynching conference and filed formal charges against Foster, Tuscaloosa Sheriff R. L. Shamblin and his staff, and a private detective named W. I. Huff for committing and or abetting the murders. The criticisms infuriated Judge Foster and mortified Tuscaloosa's leading white citizens, who now began to blame the ILD for the entire incident. The Tuscaloosa Citizens Protective League retaliated by raiding black homes throughout the county. 31. Emotions reached a fevered pitch when an 84-year-old invalid, Dennis Cross, was accused of raping a mentally retarded white woman just weeks after the Pippin and Hardin lynching. Although Tuscaloosa police dismissed the young woman's claim, the case never came to trial. The elderly black man was lifted from his bed. 32. Though known communists were nowhere in the vicinity when Dennis Cross was murdered, and ILD activist Lewis Harper had been run out of town weeks earlier, anti-communist sentiment fueled a continuing wave of racial violence. The Negro Civic League suffered the brunt of the counterattack and was ultimately driven out of existence, in part because it had established ties with Harper prior to the lynchings. The situation remained tense for quite some time. A year later, J. R. Steelman, a noted liberal Alabama professor who had investigated Tuscaloosa's racial violence for the Southern Commission on the Study of Lynching, was approached one night by a mob of Klansmen who accused him of being an ILD agitator. Although Steelman vigorously denied the charge, hostility toward 33. The ILD's reputation ruined relations with Alabama liberals, but its inability to build a united front did not impede its work in the courtroom. In June 1933, Circuit Judge James E. Horton overturned the jury's verdict on the Haywood-Patterson trial and ordered a new trial for the defendant. 34. Charles Houston, Dean of Howard University Law School and Chief Legal Counsel for the NAACP, felt the two decisions forewarned of a social crisis which may determine future leadership of Negroes in the South. Houston grudgingly conceded that the ILD has black people's complete confidence for sincerity and courage, even where they do not endorse its policies. The Peterson case, he felt, was the last hope for the NAACP in the South. If the NAACP loses out in the Peterson case, the leadership of Negroes in the South passes irretrievably to the ILD. The association's inability to free Peterson led to a sharp schism within the Birmingham branch. When a faction led by President E. W. Taggart tried unsuccessfully to persuade the branch to join forces with the ILD, they were immediately 35. NAACP Secretary Charles McPherson, Taggart's most vocal opponent, convinced the branch executive board to retain John W. Altman, one of Birmingham's most prominent attorneys, to appeal the Peterson case before the U.S. Supreme Court. But this last-ditch effort was to no avail. In January 1934, the court refused to hear the case, leaving the NAACP no choice but to turn to its last alternative, a gubernatorial gift of clemency for Willie Peterson. Appealing to Governor Benjamin Miller and Alabama's leading citizens, Walter White and local NAACP officials argued that Peterson's execution must be halted primarily for political reasons, for it would give communists the most powerful argument they have ever had for propaganda among Negroes. Under the advisement of several Alabama law officers who were skeptical of Peterson's guilt, the governor agreed to 36. The appeal for clemency in lieu of freedom was unacceptable to ILD activists, and equally disappointing to Henrietta Peterson, who now announced her unequivocal support for the ILD. The NAACP drew even more criticism when it agreed to have blacks barred from the clemency hearings. Offended by the announcement, a disgruntled group of ILD members, including Henrietta Peterson, traveled to Montgomery and unsuccessfully tried to force their way into the hearings. Rebuffed by police, they instead staged a demonstration across the 37. Amid the faint echo of ILD slogans rising from the streets below, Charles McPherson submitted an illuminating petition to the governor that summed up the political meaning of the case. Communism, not Peterson's innocence or guilt, was the issue at hand. The NAACP congratulated itself for keeping the case within the orderly, respected and dignified channels, and away from organizations radical in their nature and foreign in their purposes. The petition merely asked that the NAACP be rewarded for its protracted fight against the ILD and because it spurned overtures to resort to mass pressure, to stimulate public opinion, to magnify in the eyes of the world the actual persecution of the accused, and for our profound faith that justice would prevail and mercy sustains. The reward was granted. Peterson's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He died of 38. Established black leaders heralded the governor's decision, but the hundreds who had joined the ILD-led Peterson defense committees, as well as several rank-and-file NAACP members, scoffed at the association's self-congratulatory tone. "The public is divided," wrote McPherson, "into two groups, naturally, with reference to what we accomplished by our intelligent handling of the Peterson case. Those who are communistically inclined are disappointed in that we did not free him. In retrospect, had the ILD been involved in litigation, it might not have fared any better, but Peterson's supporters saw only the refusal of American courts to free a man who was undoubtedly innocent. Choosing to forego another appeal, the NAACP soon removed the Willie Peterson case from its agenda altogether, and as a 39. Meanwhile, the ILD in Birmingham, which had grown to 3,000 by 1934, began to eclipse all other established black organizations. During that same year, the ILD defended Selma city employee Ed Johnson after he was charged with raping a white woman. Johnson's charges were dismissed when the alleged victim admitted in court that police forced her to invent the story, announcing to the jury that she would not be like Victoria Price, but like Ruby Bates, she would tell the truth. Upon his release, Johnson was almost handed over to a lynch mob, but the ILD foiled the plan by organizing a defense squad of ex-servicemen, who surrounded him and took him to a safe place. A few months later, the ILD intervened on behalf of Walter Brown, a black steel worker from Bessemer who was charged with rape and attempted murder. Like Willie Peterson, Brown did not fit the victim's description, and numerous witnesses testified to his whereabouts at 40. the time of the crime. But he was convicted nonetheless and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Of all the communist-led mass organizations in Alabama, the ILD undoubtedly evoked the strongest emotions from both blacks and whites. While most whites viewed the ILD as outside agitators who defended black rapists in an effort to bring about a race war and a sexual revolution in the South, many black working people saw the organization as a sort of public defender for the race. The ILD's popularity in the black community, however, made them automatic rivals of the black elite in general and the NAACP in particular. In a way, black and white activists in the ILD asserted themselves as defenders of the African American community's basic constitutional and civil rights, and thus entered a realm of political practice usually considered the preserve of black bourgeois or liberal interracial movements. The ILD was not just one additional voice speaking out on behalf of poor blacks. It was a movement composed of poor blacks. It not only provided free legal defense and sought to expose the class basis of racism in the South, it gave black working people what traditional middle-class organizations would not, a political voice. Chapter 5, Negroes Ain't Black, but Red. Black Communists and the Culture of Opposition. No MOKU Klux Klan with their burning crosses. No MO chain gangs, we's no dogs no hoses. The NAACP, God no Moses can stop us blackies fightin' the bosses. Negroes ain't black, but red. Teacher Lennon done said brothers all oppressed and pay, ain't it so? Show. No MO, no MO. CP Song, CA 1930s. In 1930, a columnist for the Daily Worker predicted that the Communist Party in the South would be composed of young whites, who are not so weighed down by the prejudices of their parents. But historical reality, as we have seen thus far, had little in common with this writer's vision of rebellious white youth leading the hitherto sleeping black masses in the march to self-determination. Indeed, the prevalence of blacks in the CP earned it the epithet, Nigger Party, throughout the South. These uninitiated men and women were not intellectuals sympathetic to left-wing movements, nor were they frustrated labor organizers weary of the pace of change. With the possible exception of Montgomery Party leader John Beans, Alabama's black cadre of unskilled and semi-skilled industrial workers, sharecroppers, domestics, and housewives had rural roots and no previous experience with radical movements. Accustomed to recruiting working people knowledgeable and sympathetic to left-wing causes, District Organizer Tom Johnson noted with surprise that Alabama's black cadre were not old sympathizers of the party who have been on the fringe of the movement for some time and have absorbed some of our theory and 1. Ironically, what had presumably frustrated Johnson and other leading communists ensured the party's growth and survival in Alabama. Because the movement was built from scratch by people without a Euro-American left-wing tradition, Alabama's black cadre interpreted communism through the lenses of their own cultural world and the international movement of which they were now a part. Far from being a slumbering mass waiting for communist direction, black working people entered the movement with a rich culture of opposition that sometimes contradicted, sometimes reinforced the left's vision of class struggle. The party offered more than a vehicle for social contestation. It offered a framework for understanding the roots of poverty and racism, linked local struggles to world politics, challenged not only the hegemonic ideology of white supremacy but the petit bourgeois racial politics of the black middle class, and created an atmosphere in which ordinary people could analyze, discuss, and criticize the society in which they lived. The meshing of an African-American culture of opposition and a Stalinist version of Marxism-Leninism during the radical third period will be the subject of this chapter. We will first explore how a Marxist pedagogy in Birmingham and rural Alabama altered black working people's self-definition and pre-existing worldview. Then, turning to the traditions of resistance blacks brought to the party, we will explore how these various modes of opposition affected collective and individual action and dialectically fused with left culture. Finally, we will discuss the complexities and ambiguities of black radical opposition by examining conflict within the black community between communists, clergy, and black middle-class spokespersons. By exploring interracial conflicts, we can gain an even deeper understanding of the social, cultural, and ideological nature of this perplexing movement. 2. During a brief tour of Birmingham at the Communist Party's invitation, radical playwright John Howard Lawson Herndon, older comrade, explained to a young recruit the importance of patience, humility, and study. "There ain't one of us here was born a communist. We learned it, and it ain't easy to learn." The unidentified activist who caught Lawson's attention summed up a critical, and often overlooked, component of communist political culture. From the outset, communist organizers created educational structures to turn ordinary workers into Marxists. In May 1930, district organizer Tom Johnson held classes for new party members in Birmingham and Chattanooga, and by October the district committee boasted of its first two-week party training school in the South. These training schools were never permanent, however, partly because of the party's underground character and scant resources. More importantly, these imported educational structures were ill-suited to teaching theory to a largely illiterate and semi-literate membership. Frustrated to the point of abandoning the project, Tom Johnson described the new recruits as raw green workers with a much. 3. Nevertheless, illiterate activists found creative ways to overcome their inability to read and write, which included having party material read to them. The party formed study groups that read works in pamphlet form, ranging from James Allen's Negro Liberation and Lenin's What Is to Be Done to Marx and Engels's Communist Manifesto. By mid-1934, the Bessemer section of the party designated 1/2 hour of each meeting for study, 15 minutes of reading aloud and 15 minutes devoted to discussion. Local leaders made literate members responsible for tutoring their illiterate comrades by establishing partners who met on a regular basis and read communist tabloids together. Publications such as The Southern Worker, The Daily Worker, Working Woman, The Labor Defender, The Young Worker, and The Liberator were also important sources of information for black communists. Rank-and-file activists not only tended to have little formal education, but few blacks even owned radios. In 1930, only 3% of Birmingham's black community, or 795 families, owned a radio. 4. Circulation of party publications in real numbers was never great, but their readership was much more extensive than subscriptions and individual sales could ever indicate. Because few people could spare money to purchase communist newspapers regularly, a single copy would often serve an entire block, to be passed from hand to hand or read aloud to a group. Moreover, in light of vigilante repression and seditious literature ordinances, possession of radical material could have easily led to arrest or physical intimidation. It was common for party organizers in the Black Belt to hide a stack of papers in a hollow tree to be picked up later. As one member of the SCU Executive Committee explained in 1933, "It is not easy for us to get the Daily Worker, but we sneak it in our cabins. One copy goes." 5. Unlike the local labor press, or even the mainstream black press, communist publications carried articles describing the struggles in Africa and the Caribbean. The Liberator had special significance for black Alabamians because, much like the Garveyite Negro world, it was devoted to racial issues. Hosea Hudson was especially fond of the Liberator because it always was carrying something about the liberation of black people, something about Africa, something about the South. We would read this. 6. The party's version of Marxist education taught poor blacks to connect their own lives to struggles throughout the world, and the party's economic theories provided explanations for a number of phenomena, including the roots of poverty, wealth, and racism. But blacks also found within these study groups a source of pride, for after all, many were now receiving what white society had too often denied them, an education. John Garner, a semi-literate coal miner who gave up sharecropping in Bullitt County for the Birmingham mines, recalled that one of the main reasons for joining the party and remaining a communist for so long was the education it gave him. His membership lasted over half a century. Black communists fortunate enough to study at the Workers' School in New York, or in some cases at the Lenin School in Moscow, found the experience tantamount to obtaining a diploma of sorts and returned to Alabama proudly exhibiting their newly acquired knowledge. In 1934, Hosea Hudson, who was illiterate at the time, along with 2 other communists, rode the rails to New York in the dead of winter to attend a 10-week course at the Workers' School. Hudson returned a changed man. "I felt like I'm somebody. I'm talking about political economy, about the society itself, how it automatically would breed war and fascism. I'm discussing about the danger of imperialist war. Seeing himself as a learned individual deserving of the respect better class Negroes received, Hudson often shared his knowledge with non-party people, using as his forum the customary social habitat of black males. I'd be discussing socialism in the barber shop. We'd start the conversation off, then we'd talk about socialism, and how the workers' conditions would be improved under socialism. They'd sit down there and wouldn't no one ask no questions, wouldn't interrupt what I'm saying. 7. When party work required traveling to another state or country, the trip itself was an educational experience. Cornelia Foreman, Archie Mosley, Mac Code, Henry O. Mayfield, and Al Murphy were among the black Alabamians who traveled to Moscow in the 1930s. Murphy, who was a delegate to the Seventh World Congress in Moscow in 1935, experienced a sense of freedom that was unheard of in the South. During his visit he fell in love with and married a white Soviet woman, but knowing American racism as he did, Murphy could not return to the United States with her. Leaving the woman he loved behind, Murphy opted not to return south, choosing instead to continue party work in Brooklyn, New York, until he was assigned to Missouri in 1937. Capitola Tasker and her husband Charles, PERS sharecroppers from Montgomery County, both traveled a great deal on behalf of the SCU and the Communist Party. Charles Tasker was a delegate to the Chicago Farm Conference held in November 1933, and in the following year, Capitola Tasker was sent to Paris, France, to address the Women's International Congress Against War and Fascism on the SCU's behalf. This international gathering of women made a tremendous impact on Capitola Tasker. It was heaven on earth, she told the delegates, to see all those women who speak different languages all voting in harmony for 8. The alternative education not only gave the young, rebellious constituency of the YCL a sense of pride, it also further underscored the contradictions between what they were being told in the classroom and what they experienced daily. As one YCL organizer in Birmingham explained to the young worker, "In school they teach us a lot of bunk about what a wonderful country this is, and that everyone gets an equal chance. In the rural areas, YCL study groups were very popular because they served as surrogate schools for those unable to attend public schools. The role that these youth-led, makeshift classes played cannot be overestimated in a region where black children attended school on an average of 3 months of the year and annual educational expenditures for black schools averaged 9. Under the leadership of Eula Gray, by 1934 7 units of the YCO were formed in Alabama's Black Belt and Tallapoosa County, and about 100 Camp Hill students had planned to affiliate with the communist-led NSL. Gray estimated that young men and women constituted at least 1/3 of the SCU's total membership. Nevertheless, party literature was hard to come by and nearly impossible to purchase in a region where most rural families could not even afford basic necessities. YCL members occasionally made requests for material through letters to the communist press or simply begged for any redundant pamphlets comrades passing through might have. 10. Pedagogy directed toward black youth did not stop at study groups. Sometimes it was sustained by rural families. Although several scholars have argued that Southern black mothers raised their children to be submissive in order to ensure their survival in a violent, racist world, many young activists who were mothers themselves rejected this tradition, and, in 11. Throughout the Black Belt and Tallapoosa County, the children of communists and some SCU activists belonged to the Young Pioneers, a national communist children's auxiliary whose slogan was, "Smash the Boy Scouts." When they could obtain copies, these children read the Young Pioneer, the organization's regular organ, and were undoubtedly drawn to Michael Kort's Black History cartoons depicting the lives of Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and Toussaint Louverture. Matt Owen, Kort's popular cartoon strip that had appeared regularly in The Young Worker, must have made a tremendous impression on pioneers as well as YCL activists. Part of the serialized epic depicted a black youth educating 2 naive white boys about the class struggle while 12. Although it is impossible to measure the party's impact on these children, during the mid-1930s local authorities in counties with a substantial SCU following feared the growing impudence of black youth, and local agricultural extension officers went so far as to adopt measures to de-radicalize children whose parents were suspected union members. At the height of the 1935 cotton pickers' strike, Lee County Extension agents built up their 4-H clubs among blacks and distributed a song book entitled Games and Songs for Old and Young. That included an illuminating parody of Row, Row, Row Your Boat. Fight Lynch Terror. Fight Lynch Terror. Young Worker, 1930. Ho, ho, ho your row steadily every day. Merrily, merrily, cheerily, cheerily, half our work is play. Smash the barriers. 13. Communist education, whether through reading or oral transmission, introduced poor rural and urban blacks to international politics and, in turn, placed their own local, seemingly insignificant struggles within a world context. The history of the October Revolution, for example, was among John Garner's first lessons in the history of his movement. Stalin and Lenin and Molotov, and all those party leaders, they taught folks how to pitch the capitalists off their back and they armed them to go to World War I, then they turned the guns on the bosses. That brought about the revolution. When German communist leader Ernst Thälmann was incarcerated under Hitler, communists and SCU members in Tallapoosa County made it their own struggle, distributing hundreds of leaflets throughout the rural eastern Piedmont attacking Nazism and pledging support for the German Communist Party. Eula Gray also organized a mass rally outside of Dadeville to protest Thälmann's imprisonment. By 1934, when anti-war slogans became ever more prominent in the party's national program, rank-and-file communists throughout the state held mass anti-war meetings and produced anti-war literature describing events in Europe. The August 1st anti-war picnic held in Dadeville, attended by over 250 people, provides a remarkable example of rural black communists' ability to combine local and international traditions. Following a friendly baseball game and a mouth harp contest, the group joined together in altered versions of "We Shall Not Be Moved" and "Solidarity," whose lyrics described the militancy and determination of the SCU. As they devoured plates of fried chicken, collard greens, and other culinary contributions, these women, children, and men listened to, among other things, a young Lee County woman speak on "Why I Like the YCL," a report on the Young Pioneers, and a speech on the woman question, by a leading female SCU leader. They then closed the gathering with renditions of "Arise You Workers" and the 14. The emergence of a counter-hegemonic ideology within party circles owes much to Marxist pedagogy, but black communists were not blank sheets when they entered the movement. Instead, they were born and reared in communities with a rich culture of opposition, a culture that enveloped and transformed the party into a movement more reflective of African American radical traditions than anything else. Thus, black communists retained significant cultural influences that resonated through the Leninist wrappings, determining the everyday character of grassroots activity, and, indeed, providing historical legitimacy for the party's very existence in Alabama. Even before many black working people jumped headlong into party work, their evaluation of the movement from afar was often rooted in what George Lipsitz calls a collective memory. 15. We have seen so far how common folk and literary traditions of the Civil War and Reconstruction effectively deterred poor white participation in the Communist Party. Wedded to dominant racial and sexual mores, white Alabamians responded emotionally, often violently, to communist activity and even read into basic struggles for social justice a threat to the edifice of Southern civilization. Southern blacks maintained their own informal, oral networks through which the community transmitted its vision of the past and present, a vision hidden or masked from the white world and oppositional to the core. The anti-communist propaganda that proved particularly effective among white Alabamians actually augmented the communists' appeal in the black communities. Hidden away in Southern black communities was a folk belief that the Yankees would return to wage another civil war in the South and complete the Reconstruction. When the communists arrived on the scene, veteran party activist Hosea Hudson recalls, "The Negro began to look. Something's gonna happen now. Man, them folks in the North, them folks in New York, in Russia. We thought we was looking to have a war in the South. And when the organizers of the party came in there representing what these organizations what the Negro been reading about in the paper, this is what brought the Negroes into the organization. They thought." 16. Angelo Hernan's attraction to communists also contained echoes of the past. Conditions were so bad, he later wrote, that many people believed that the only way they could ever get better was to start a new war. I very naively was under the impression that the Unemployed Council was calling all Negro and white workers to a new war. The idea that the party's appearance marked the first skirmishes in a new civil war was reiterated in a novel by Myra Page, a party member who spent considerable time with Alabama militants. As one of her characters put it, in The Black Belt, "A long, bitter scrap's brewin'. Us communists, white and colored, gotta organize in." 17. What distinguished this new war from the Civil War and Reconstruction was its international dimension. For many black radicals, the Russians were the new Yankees, Stalin was the new Lincoln, and the Soviet Union was a new Ethiopia, stretching forth her arms in defense of black folk. Southern propaganda depicting communists as Soviet agents worked to the party's advantage in black working-class communities. The idea of Soviet and or Northern radical support provided a degree of psychological confidence for African Americans hoping to wage the long-awaited revolution in the South. With the collapse of biracial unionism and the failure of black middle-class organizations to create a viable alternative, most poor blacks had little confidence in their ability to initiate and sustain a movement without outside assistance. Outnumbered and outgunned, thousands chose migration over militant organization, which many saw as potentially suicidal. A black woman from Orrville, Alabama, provides a telling example. In a letter to the Daily Worker she wrote, "We need some help in pushing this movement here. We will keep all your orders secret." 18. Faced with the centrality of Russia and popular notions of communism, black radicals, unconsciously, constructed a folklore that mythologized the Soviet Union. John Garner was convinced that Soviet agents organized the party in Alabama. The Soviet Union had agents, he remembered. That was educating people about the Communist Party. Them agents was all through here. Likewise, Lemon Johnson, local leader of the Share Croppers Union in Hope Hull, Alabama, felt that Russian support was essential to the Union's success, partly because he believed that all the leaflets, handbills, and newspapers he distributed were printed in Russia. Johnson was not alone in his assessment. When a black sharecropper heard about the Daily Worker and the activities of the communists, he searched in vain for a copy of the newspaper. Unsuccessful, he hit upon the idea of 19. The assurance of outside support, even if imagined, and the physical presence of collective organization, engendered a sense of power that lent itself to isolated acts of counter-aggression or self-defense. The communist presence in Alabama served precisely this function, emboldening individual members who might otherwise have retreated from confrontation. Late in 1934, for example, 8 robed Klansmen broke into the home of North Birmingham communist Steve Simmons and administered a near-fatal beating. When his assailants later discovered, ironically by reading the Daily Worker, that he had survived the beating, they paid him another visit. But this time he had barred the doors and windows, and he used his shotgun to disperse the crowd, injuring one member of the mob. A third raid led by 2 off-duty Birmingham police officers also met Simmons's buckshot. An embarrassed police department complied with the ILD's demand to remove the 2 officers and finally provided limited protection for the Simmons household. Similarly, when black communist Saul Davis was kidnapped from his Bessemer home, stripped bare, and whipped for several hours, he defiantly returned to Bessemer to work on behalf of the ILD, even before his wounds had completely healed. Such actions should not be interpreted simply as individual acts of heroism or recklessness. Instead, they represented a broader change in attitude, a growing comfort in the strength of collective action and outside support. Although vigilantes slowed communist efforts, successful resistance to their attacks neutralized their efficacy because, like 20. Lynching, vigilante violence depends ultimately on the overall impression it makes on the community. For the most part, however, black radicals resorted to violent confrontation only when there were no other avenues available. Indeed, communists went to great lengths to avoid violence and open conflict. Like their enslaved ancestors of the antebellum South, black Alabama communists understood the terrain of struggle and relied primarily on 21. These evasive tactics stood in stark contrast to communist theoreticians' image of class struggle and the left literati's constructions of working-class heroism. Poems and short stories in left periodicals painted a portrait of radical Puritans whose unfolding consciousness leapt dramatically from complete docility to revolutionary. 22. But proletarian realism hardly depicted African American realities in the Deep South. Organizers had to rely on their cunning and wit simply to survive, and that often meant wearing a mask of deception. When black communist Harry Haywood arrived in Birmingham, he was told to cut out that fast walking with your head up in the air, or these crackers will spot you. Get that slouch in your walk. Look scared, as if you are about to run. Although these instructions were offered partly in jest, Haywood recognized a grain of truth in these remarks. Sometimes communists used deception to avoid arrest and its potentially violent sequel. Following the Birmingham May Day Battle of 1933, for example, one of the arrestees, ILD organizer and communist Otis de Bartleben, practiced the art of dissimulation to prevent an almost guaranteed jail sentence. Switching his demeanor from militant to Sambo, de Bartleben convinced the judge that he had been misled into attending the meeting, because when he read the leaflet inviting all workers, he assumed it was something like this forestry thing, and therefore he went there thinking he could get a job. While communists Jane Speed and Ned Goodwin spent time in jail, de Bartleben was only required to pay a $25 fine and was 23. Much like the trickster characters in African American folklore, many black Alabama communists expressed great pride in their ability to outsmart the bosses, as revealed by the ingenious ways activists distributed leaflets in direct violation of seditious literature ordinances and constant police surveillance. In Birmingham, black women posing as laundresses picked up bundles of leaflets, stencils, and paper from the homes of white communists and smuggled the materials out in baskets of laundry. The leaflets were then distributed throughout the city but were concentrated mainly in Birmingham's various black communities. John Garner recalls with pride and amusement his ability to distribute party material without police molestation. I'd pass by, stick 'em in your door, laughs. Or you'd throw it at your gate. You go into the store to trade. While trading, I'd have a bundle. I'd leave a bundle on the counter there. They didn't never catch me putting out nothing. I had a way to sneak 'em out. ILD activist Dobby Sanders had his own method of spreading the printed word. I would stick 'em in my lunch bucket, untie the strings and let the wind blow the leaflets all over the yard. I just keep steppin' like nothing ever happened. When leaflets would not suffice, Birmingham radicals left their mark in other ways. While visiting Birmingham in 1934, Myra Page came across the letters, ILD, carved into what was once the wet, fresh concrete. 24. In the rural areas, handbills announcing strikes or simply popularizing the SCU were not only distributed to other sharecroppers but targeted at the landlords as well. All these big white folks, Lemon Johnson recalled. We'd throw them at their door, put them in the mailbox, be making our demands. These mimeographed sheets were in lieu of demonstrations, allowing the union to confront the landlords from an apparent position of strength while protecting the anonymity of its members. Landlords and police referred to SCU leaflets as night mail because they appeared so frequently, and yet could not be traced to anyone. A letter to the young worker described how a group of sharecroppers fooled an infuriated gathering of landlords and overseers who had paraded the countryside to find the ones who were distributing the leaflets. To avoid capture, the sharecroppers hid in the bushes until the parade had passed and then got back on the job of putting out their leaflets. In fact, many rural organizers,